left the airport and we're currently in the bus on the way to the hotel. So I thought I would introduce you to all of my friends since I know them but you don't. So first of all we have Nick. Hi. You know what she said?
Stop.
Spanish people do not speak Spanish.
I'm tired. We just took a flight.
I do drive.
No.
Spanish people don't speak Spanish.
Hallo. Ik heb net de eerste keer vliegen overleefd. Ik ben in Barcelona. Ik heb weer dit
Gewoon hallo, ik ben Marie toch?
Hallo. Ik ben Marie. Stel je voor.
Stel je voor. Wat?
Stel je voor, wie ben je?
Ah! Ik ben Jesse.
Oké. Ik ben Pip en ik ga gang.
Hey.
Film.
It's 7 p.m. or something. I'm hella happy to be here. Just know I'm hella happy.
Oh, hell yeah.
It's hella fancy, bro. This is the second time I'm filming this, but this is the bedroom. Look, first of all, look at me. Hella fancy. We have a sink, we have a hair dryer, we have towels, we have a toilet. I love toilets. Then next up, we have a shower. This soap stinks hella bad, by the way.
Smells bad.
Luckily I took my own. Bro!
Kijk mijn vinger.
No, nee, ik wil die niet ruiken. Die stinkt echt. It is. I really love is that the shower is not attached to the bathroom, toilet, blah, blah, blah. So it means somebody can shower in the morning and somebody can brush their teeth and we can do it at the same time. All my friends are crying eyes, bro. All my friends are crying eyes. A girl in the airport, she saw me when I was boarding. She was like, is it très joli? Et moi, j'en suis. Good morning, Barcelona. My friends just left to go to the breakfast because my mom called me, so I was talking to her, my dad, and my youngest sister really quickly. I have to rush now because I'm actually pretty hungry too. So bye. I'll show you the breakfast ASAP. I haven't been talking much in the vlog because I've been with school. I'm not gonna be talking around all of my schoolmates. We're with 90. Okay, I mean that's not that much, but 90 people to vlog around is, I think that's a pretty big number. I'm ready to go eat.
Ja, en mocht je inderdaad heel veel plezier zijn.
Gaan wij samen gebruiken?
Een beetje extra
Ja, wat is het kanaal?
Morna en Morna.
Tik.
Maar daar is geen auto.
Went to a cafe to drink something and I had the pineapple juice and then we wanted to pay.
And then we got free shots.
Yes, first we got lollies.
Because we were pretty chicas.
This is like, do you guys want a shot? No wait, do you guys drink alcohol?
No.
Maybe. Do you guys want a shot?
Yeah.
So they got shots in exchange for a little view, but they don't mind. Do you mind?
Nah.
Very pretty. My jeans outfit. Actually wearing all of my good fits right now, so if you see any of these outfits again in the next vlogs, you know why. My mysterious aura, people. Anyways, good morning. I'm late, so all of my roommates have already left. Of course, I still had to call my family. Yummy. Oh.
Sorry.
Allemaal bessen. Hallo. Hi. Zwaai.
Kijk naar boven.
Naar boven hebben we Mora. Zwaai.
Wie zijn jullie?
Zwaaiers.
Dat is Noah.
I just took a shower and now it's actually bedtime. So very sleepy. I had a lot of fun today on the hike since, you know, we went the mountain up and that actually killed me. I'm not gonna talk much. I just wanted to update because I kind of want to live in the moment, but film for the memories. Good night. Yes, I'm late to breakfast again. I'm rushing. Focus, focus, focus. I'm rushing. Yes, I'm late, but I don't bang us. And the rest lopen. Muchas gracias. I'm not here mentally. Tired. Oranges. Orange. Orange. Uh-oh. An accomplice. Good morning. This feels very revealing. I'm happy I didn't wear this with a skirt because that would have been double kill. And 10 minutes late today. I guessed when I saw this, I just went, I am gonna fucking die. Ugh.
Dank u. Hallo. Al die pollen steken in mijn neus.
Interessant.
Ik vond het ook echt heel leuk.
Come to the yum yum. Round tree. Statistics is everywhere apparently. It's a nightmare truly though. I don't like statistics. And here it is again. Wow. Zijn die niet Die is zeer blij. Every day, got my heartbeat stuck on replay. Oh. Mira. Wow, wow. Boe.
Dat is crazy.
Bij de tapolie. I'm extremely tired, by the way. We're gonna go out and eat pizzas on the beach.
Ja, ik snap ook niet. Te moeilijk naar strand.
We're currently out and about. I'm in the toilet of the restaurant where we're ordering pizzas. We're already off to a great start. Somebody has puked. First official time properly going out. Nice restaurant, by the way. Nee.
Die zat de mensen die dat niet willen.
Talen, hè?
De dikste.
Girl dad.
Ja, maar we zijn hier